tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
The never-ending lockdown continues. I'm in Ontario, which is basically ground zero of the never-ending lockdown. We don't have a curfew like our friends in Quebec do just yet, although it's something that seems to be perennially on the discussion table among Ontario's Conservative government. Even places like Alberta, which have in the past been saying that we're open for business, are drifting back into lockdown mindsets and restriction mindsets. And the carrot that the government has been dangling in front of voters since the very beginning of this pandemic, well, not the very beginning. At first, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then 2 weeks more, and then hang on, let's just get past Easter, and then it was okay until there's a vaccine. Well, the vaccine's here. And even if it is coming pretty slowly, and even if a lot of people still have questions about when and how they'll be able to get it, the vaccine was promised by the government as being the antidote to lockdowns and restrictions. Well, enter Justin Trudeau.
I think it's really important that we work from facts and understanding of the science around things. We know, for example, that the UK is ahead of just about everybody else on vaccinations, and yet they maintain very strong restrictions and are facing a very serious third wave. Vaccinations on their own are not enough to keep us safe. We need to engage in the right kinds of behaviors, do things that the Conservatives aren't always good at, like wearing masks, keeping distances, and obeying public health rules.
Now, that clip of Justin Trudeau has been summarily mocked all around the world. Tucker Carlson did a lengthy segment on Justin Trudeau's mishandling of this, in which he played that clip and, again, raised the obvious question of what is then the point? What is then the point? If you say that Canadians are doomed to a life with mask mandates and lockdowns and other restrictions, even with being vaccinated, what is the whole point of getting a vaccine? You're either saying that the vaccine is ineffective, or you are saying that it doesn't matter and that you like exacting this control over the population, which is precisely what anti-lockdown advocates have been saying since the very beginning of this. And I do believe that the people who are open to lockdowns that aren't dogmatically in favor of them are very much moving away from that position. I've seen, as governments plunge people into third lockdowns, more and more people who are not conservative or not even political start to say, hang on, this isn't right. I have done my part. I've done everything you've asked of me. I've, gotten the vaccine if I'm eligible. I've closed my business once. I've closed it twice. And people are saying, what gives? So now when they hear the government, remember that some businesses cannot exist with the restrictions. Restaurants cannot turn a huge profit when they have to take out half the tables in them. Church attendance is already something that is under strain. Churches cannot make a lot of money in contributions if people are not in the pews and actually contributing and putting into the collection plates. There are lots of other examples of where businesses, institutions, agencies cannot survive under their modified reopenings. That's if they're even allowed to be open in modified form, which is not something that can be taken for granted in this day and age. So when everyone is looking at the government and then Justin Trudeau gets up there and says, well, even with the vaccine doesn't really matter. Now, I think part of that is that he's trying to deflect from the fact that most people in this country are not fully vaccinated. I think Canada's Canada likes to look at the percentage of people that have their first dose of a vaccine, which is in and of itself not worth writing home about. But for fully vaccinated, Canada is sitting at, I think, 2.2%, maybe 2.5% as of the time this comes out. And that means that 97+% of Canadians are not immune in the sense of what the government has previously stated is its target for immunity. And what in the United States the CDC is saying means you can go around and walk free, what's allowing the United Kingdom to open up. So when Trudeau says that the UK is heading into a dangerous third wave, even with vaccines, well, that's not what the numbers are saying. No, just look at that chart. And Boris Johnson has claimed that lockdowns, not vaccines, were what saved people, which is in and of itself a load of bunk. But the UK has people out in pubs, partying in the streets, hanging out, and they are very safe if you look at the numbers. So the reason I bring all of this up is because there's more and more, I think, of a shift towards a lot of the concerns that anti-lockdown advocates who were derided as fringe were bringing up months ago. The End the Lockdowns Caucus, a movement of federal, provincial, and municipal current and former politicians, I've talked about it before, they had a press conference on Parliament Hill Thursday, in which independent MP Derek Sloan, independent Ontario MPP Randy Hillier, Pastor Michael Thiessen, and former MP and now PPC leader Maxime Bernier talked about what they see as being the greatest threat to Canadians right now. And it wasn't just, by the way, COVID, but the lockdowns that governments have imposed as a response to COVID. And I asked a question that I thought yielded a very interesting response, which was, this is something that affects everyone. It's not just people on the right that are upset with lockdowns. Why are we not seeing more of a shift towards embracing the End the Lockdowns caucus from people who aren't conservatives? This was the answer I got.
Good morning, gentlemen. One thing that I'm seeing just from ordinary Canadians is that there's a lot of opposition to lockdowns coming from people who are not partisan conservatives or not even particularly political. And we're seeing this across the spectrum. But I noticed that in the End the Lockdowns caucus, it's not just politicians who have been identified with conservatism or with right-of-center movements, but even a smaller subset of that. So I'm wondering why you're not seeing more support for your cause from politicians that disagree with you on other things, but may agree with you on ending lockdowns.
Thank you for that question. You know, a lot of it has to do with party discipline in this country. The majority of people in our federal and provincial parliaments belong to a specific party. And we have we have strict discipline here. There's an understanding, either implicit or explicit, that you toe the party line. And none of the party leaders have decided to be against the lockdowns or message on these things. And so I think a lot of people that have issues or maybe questions are afraid to color outside of the lines. Overall, I think by leaders and others, it's a failure of courage, a failure of being willing to perhaps stand up and say, hey, we made some mistakes, we've learned, we want to move on. But it's a failure of courage. And I think that's what Canada needs right now, is more courage.
I think what Derek gave a good encapsulation there. I'll just maybe flesh that out a tiny bit. The problems that we're facing in our society of the need to conform within society, our political environment is much the same, but in a smaller microcosm of the distortions and the perversions. That's what's happening. And people in elected office, especially at the federal and the provincial level, many of them understand that their path to re-election is only through a registered political party, and they will not jeopardize their path to re-election, even if it means forsaking their children's and their grandchildren's future. They are going along, many of them, knowing that what we're doing is wrong and casts a significant darkness for our future. The same thing happens, although not quite as clearly identified at the municipal level, but we've seen what has happened with members of the End the Lockdown caucus at the municipal level who have joined. Stephen Van Leeuwen was ostracized and attempted to be and faced much scorn for joining the End the Lockdown caucus. He was removed from the position as deputy mayor. We've seen others, Mayor David Blisma from West Lincoln was removed from the COVID Health Committee for joining the End the Lockdown caucus. We see this everywhere. COVID is being used to beat people into submission and into conformity. That anybody knows, if you want to have honest, truthful, public discussion and discourse. You will pay a price. I'm very thankful that the End the Lockdown Caucus are strong men and women across this country who know what it is to be Canadian and know that they will, whatever the price that we were asked to pay, that we will pay it because our children and our grandchildren, their future is worth it. Thank you.
I thought that was a valid enough answer. There is more than one way to skin a cat, as the expression goes, although I believe cat skinning has been declared a non-essential service in most provinces. So no cat skinning today, and not until we flatten the curve or whatever the case is. And the problem is that you get a lot of people that want the debate to be had in their area and under their concerns specifically. So there were a couple of Alberta MLAs that departed the End the Lockdowns caucus because they didn't like that Randy Hillier shared a comparison to the Nazis. And then you have Roman Baber in Ontario who's trying to do his own thing and taking the government to court, and he doesn't want to associate with these people. And you've got some left-wing voices that are speaking out against it that don't want to be aligned with conservatives. And ultimately, I would love to see a cross-partisan array of lawmakers who say, yeah, we may disagree on taxes, on climate change, we may disagree on abortion, we may disagree on everything, but we believe that we need to have an evidence-based approach and we want to reopen. I would love to see that. And if the anti-lockdown movement were not fractured in the way that it is now, I think there would be a huge market and a huge appetite for a group like that no one would be able to ignore. When you've got the call coming from inside all of the houses, not just a group of people that are maligned or cast off by the media and political elites as fringe, but you've got Liberals, New Democrats, Conservatives, Greens, Bloc Québécois people that are all coming together saying, you know what, we think these lockdowns are not keeping people safe. We think they're causing more harm than good. How could party leaders avoid and ignore that? Because that's a more authentic representation of where Canadians are. To Canadians, just going back to normal life is not a left-right position. So the fact that we've allowed the media to hijack that and make that out to be reckless and fringe is absolutely asinine. And I think what's pushing more and more people to oppose these are stories. Just to give a couple of examples. In Ottawa, the medical officer of health is doing an end run around the province and trying to expect masks at city parks. So if you're outside, you're in fresh air where transmission is virtually impossible, you're going to need a mask. And in Ontario, in Toronto specifically, they are putting up caution tape around Trinity Bellwoods Park. The cherry blossoms are about to come to bloom, but cherry blossoms have also been declared non-essential, so they don't want people enjoying themselves outside, having a picnic at this park in Toronto that has become, in a lot of ways, one of the most desirable outdoor locales in Toronto, as we saw last year, because it is so picturesque. But no, that is no longer allowed as well. It's not going to be that long until government bylaw officials are picking off the cherry blossoms, because that's the only way that no one is going to be enjoying them. This is what's happening in Ontario. And as egregious as these stories are, I know that every time one of them comes out, it pushes more and more people into the sensible disobedience column about what are quite insane restrictions that do nothing for public health, but only embolden the state's control of its citizens. If you liked watching this clip of The Andrew Lawton Show, True North has lots more for you all over at www.tnc.news.